You saw those wrinkled apple rings hanging on a string in the thumbnail, and I know exactly what you thought, because I thought it too. You thought that looked like something from a poor person's kitchen, something we left behind for a reason. I want to tell you why you were wrong. Because those little dried rings held more real food, more vitamins, and more safety than half of what sits in your pantry right now in shiny bags. The old women who dried food knew things that scientists are only now putting numbers to. And the reason nobody taught you is simple. There was no money in it for anyone but you. I remember standing in my grandmother's summer kitchen in the middle of August, maybe 7 years old, watching her lay apple slices across a clean bedsheet on the porch roof. It smelled like cinnamon and hot wood. I asked her why she didn't just buy the canned kind. She looked at me and said, "The store food forgets to feed you." I didn't understand it then. I understand it now. By the time we finish, I'm going to hand you a method written down in a government bulletin from 1917, printed for ordinary families during a food shortage, that shows you how to preserve a whole summer garden with no machine, no electricity, and almost no money. And it still works today, in whatever kitchen you already have, on whatever budget you already live on. Let me start with the thing that shocked me most, because it's the thing everyone gets backward. I always believed drying food was about heat. Cook the water out, right? Blast it with high heat until it's crisp. That's what I did the first time, in my own oven, cranked up as high as it would go. I ruined a whole tray of tomatoes. They came out black on the outside and wet inside, and they molded 3 days later in the jar. Here is what my grandmother knew that I didn't. Drying food is not about heat. It's about moving air and low, patient warmth. The sweet spot is somewhere between 95 and 145 degrees Fahrenheit. Go higher, and you seal the outside shut before the inside can escape. The old-timers had a name for that mistake. They called it case hardening. The surface turns to a shell, traps the moisture inside, and that trapped water is exactly what grows mold in your jar weeks later when you think everything is safe. My grandmother never had a thermometer. She used shade, a screen, and a breeze. She dried in the warm air, not the hot air. And modern food scientists have measured why she was right. It comes down to something they call water activity. When you get the available water in a food down below a certain point, roughly a value of 0.6 on their scale, bacteria and mold simply cannot grow. They have nothing to drink. Low, slow drying pulls the water out evenly, all the way through, so the whole piece drops below that danger line. High heat only tricks you. It dries the outside and lies to you about the inside. That one idea changed everything for me. Low and slow, air over heat, patience over power. Once I understood it, my tomatoes came out leathery and sweet and lasted a year. But understanding the how is only half of it, because the moment I got good at this, I started asking a harder question. If this is so simple, so cheap, and so good for us, why did it vanish from every kitchen in America? Why did my own mother stop doing what her mother did? That question led me somewhere I did not expect, and it made me angry. Here is what happened, and I want you to sit with it. For thousands of years, drying was the main way human beings kept food alive through winter. It was the default. Then, in a very short window, it disappeared from American homes almost completely. And it didn't disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because somebody figured out how to sell us the alternative. After the Second World War, the freezer moved into the American kitchen, and the frozen food business exploded. Whole industries were built on the idea that you should keep buying, keep plugging in, Keep paying the electric company every single month to hold your food hostage in a cold box. Think about that. When you dry food, you pay once and you're done. It sits on a shelf. It costs nothing to store. When you freeze food, you pay forever, and the day the power goes out, you lose all of it. One method makes you independent, the other keeps you paying. And it went further than freezers. The packaged food companies learned that a family who dries their own garden is a family that doesn't buy their bags, their cans, their pouches, their snacks. Every apple you dry on your own porch is an apple you didn't buy from them. So the knowledge simply stopped being passed down. It wasn't in the magazines they advertised in. It wasn't in the shows their money paid for. It quietly slid out of the culture, one generation at a time, until a whole country forgot that a screen and a warm breeze could feed a family through February. I'm not telling you to throw out your freezer. I'm telling you that you were never given the choice, because the choice was inconvenient for people who profit from your dependence. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. Everything my grandmother did on that porch roof was a quiet act of freedom, and nobody told me. So let me start giving that freedom back to you, piece by piece, starting with the tricks that make the difference between food that lasts a week and food that lasts a year. The first one is the one that fixed my browning problem, and it costs almost nothing. When I first dried apples, they came out an ugly gray-brown, and I figured I'd done something wrong. I hadn't done anything wrong. That browning is just oxygen reacting with the fruit, the same way a cut apple turns brown on your counter. My grandmother stopped it with one thing she always had: lemon. Here is the specific trick. Before you dry your apples, pears, peaches, or bananas, you dip the slices in a bowl of water with lemon juice mixed in, roughly 1 cup of lemon juice to a quart of water, and let the slices soak for maybe 5 minutes. The vitamin C in the lemon, what scientists call ascorbic acid, blocks the browning reaction and actually protects the nutrients in the fruit while it dries. University extension programs, the ones run out of the agriculture colleges, still recommend this exact method today, and they put it in real numbers. That acid dip preserves color and slows the vitamin loss dramatically compared to fruit dried plain. The old women didn't know the word ascorbic acid. They just knew a squeeze of lemon kept the apples pretty and made them keep longer. They were doing biochemistry with a lemon and never knew it. Now here's the second pre-treatment trick, and this one is for your vegetables, and almost nobody does it anymore. It's called blanching. Before you dry green beans, carrots, peas, or corn, you dunk them in boiling water for just a couple of minutes, then straight into cold water to stop the cooking. It seems backward. Why add water to something you're about to dry out? Because that quick heat shocks the vegetable and stops the enzymes inside it that would otherwise keep aging and breaking it down even after it's dry. Blanched vegetables keep their color, their nutrition, and their flavor far longer on the shelf. Skip it, and your dried carrots turn to sad orange gravel that tastes like cardboard in 6 months. I learned that the hard way with a batch of green beans. I dried them raw, felt clever about it, and by winter they were tough, faded, and flat-tasting. My neighbor, a woman past 80 who grew up on a farm in the hills, took one look and said, "You didn't scald them first, did you?" Scald. That was her word for blanch, her mother's word. The knowledge was right there, one fence over, and I'd almost missed it. So now you know the how, low and slow. You know 2 pre-treatment secrets, the lemon dip and the quick scald. But I can already hear the question forming because it's the one that stopped me for a whole year before I finally tried any of this. You're thinking, This is all fine for somebody with money, somebody with a fancy machine, somebody with a big kitchen and time to spare. And I want to talk to you directly right now, especially if you're on a fixed income, especially if you're living alone, especially if you're looking at your one small kitchen and thinking, this isn't meant for someone like me. I put this next part in for you on purpose, because when I first found all this, I had less than you might think, and it worked anyway. You do not need a dehydrator. You never did. That machine is the modern add-on, the thing they sell you to make you feel you can't start without spending $100. My grandmother never owned one. The people who dried food for 10,000 years never owned one. Let me give you 3 ways to dry food today, this week, with things already in your house. The first is your oven. Almost every oven has a lowest setting, and even if the lowest is a little warm, you prop the door open a few inches with a wooden spoon and let the air move. You lay your fruit slices on a rack, set it to the lowest heat, prop that door, and let time do the work over several hours. That's it. I dried my first successful batch of apples in an ordinary electric oven with a spoon holding the door open, and I felt like I'd discovered fire. The second way costs nothing at all, and it's the one my grandmother used on that porch: sun and air. You need a screen. An old window screen works, or a rack with cheesecloth over it so nothing sticks. You lay the food out in a single layer, cover it with a light cloth to keep insects off, and set it in a warm, dry, breezy spot with good sun. You bring it in at night so the evening damp doesn't undo your progress. In hot, dry weather, fruit can dry this way in a few days. People fed whole families this way for centuries and never paid a cent for the privilege. And the third way, the one that made me laugh out loud when it worked, is your car. On a hot day, a closed car parked in the sun turns into an oven that holds right in that gentle drying range, sometimes over 130 degrees. You put your trays on the dashboard or the back seat on a towel, crack the windows just barely for airflow, and let the sunshine do it for free. Herbs and tomato slices dry beautifully this way. I did a whole batch of basil in my old sedan one July afternoon, and the car smelled like an Italian kitchen for a week. And if you find yourself wanting to go deeper into this kind of thinking, the economics of real food independence, the practical systems that let ordinary families step off that payment treadmill for good, I put a lot of that research into a book called Deeper Frugal. It walks through the hidden costs of convenience and the forgotten methods that actually free you, written for people who are already asking the questions you're asking right now. You can find it linked in the description below. Now, back to how far this rabbit hole actually goes, because it went further than freezers. None of that costs real money. A screen, a spoon, an oven you already run, a car already sitting in your driveway. If anyone tells you that self-reliance is only for people who can afford it, they're selling you something. The whole reason drying survived through the Great Depression is that it was what people did when they had nothing. During those hard years in the 1930s, families dried everything they could grow because a dried bean in a jar in October meant a meal in January. This was survival knowledge for people with empty pockets. It is the opposite of a rich person's hobby. And that brings me to the vegetables that fed the poorest families through the hardest winters, because there's one dried food that almost nobody your grandmother's age has forgotten, but almost nobody younger has ever heard of, and it might be the smartest one of all. Down through the mountains of the American South, and back through the old farm country, families made something they called leather breeches. Some called them shuck beans. What they did was take fresh green beans, whole, pods and all, and run a needle and a long thread right through the middle of each one, stringing them up like a garland. Then they hung those strings across the room, near the wood stove or in the warm rafters, and let them dry slowly, right there in the living space, all winter long. Think about how clever that is. No jars needed, no canning, no electricity. The beans hung in the air of the house, drying in the same warmth that kept the family warm. And when you wanted them, you pulled a handful off the string, soaked them overnight, and simmered them slow with a bit of fat and salt. They came out with a deep, nutty, almost smoky flavor that no fresh bean and no canned bean has ever matched. People who grew up on leather breeches talk about them the way other folks talk about their grandmother's pie. And here's the part that matters for your health, not just your budget. When you dry beans this way, whole and slow, you keep the fiber and much of the nutrition locked in, and you store them for a year in a paper sack with zero energy cost. A string of beans hanging in a dry room is food security you can see with your own eyes. It doesn't spoil when the power fails. It doesn't need a working freezer. It just waits for you, patient as an old friend. I strung my first batch 2 winters ago, hung them in my kitchen doorway, and every person who walked in asked what on earth they were. Not one of them under 60 had ever seen it. Something that fed millions of Americans through the worst years this country ever had, and it vanished so completely that people think I'm making it up. But even leather breeches, even the lemon dip, even the low and slow rule, all of it depends on one final step that almost everyone skips. And this is the one I promised you at the beginning. This is the piece that separates food that lasts a year from food that quietly rots in your jar and makes you sick without you ever knowing why. I found it written down in a document most people have never heard of. During the First World War, when food was short and the country needed every family to preserve their own harvest, the United States Department of Agriculture printed a farmer's bulletin, number 841, titled Home Drying of Fruits and Vegetables. It came out in 1917. It was mailed to ordinary households, plain families, and it laid out the whole craft in careful steps. And buried in that bulletin, and in the extension guides that still echo it today, is a step they called conditioning. Here is what conditioning is, and why it is the most important thing I will tell you all day. When you dry a batch of fruit or vegetables, every piece does not end up with exactly the same amount of moisture left inside. Some pieces are drier, some are a little damper, even if they all look done. If you seal them in a jar right away, that leftover moisture spreads unevenly, and the damper spots become exactly where mold takes hold. You've done everything right, and you still lose the batch, and you never understand what went wrong. Conditioning fixes it, and it costs nothing. After your food is dried and cooled, you pack it loosely into clear glass jars, only about 2/3 full, and you seal the lids. Then, for the next 7 to 10 days, you leave those jars on the counter where you can see them, and once a day you pick each one up and give it a good shake, so the pieces don't clump and stick together. And every single day you look. You look for any sign of moisture beating up on the inside of the glass. You look for condensation. If you see any dampness on the glass, that batch is not dry enough, and it would have molded on you in storage. So you pour it back out and dry it a little longer, then start the conditioning again. If, after those days of watching and shaking, the glass stays perfectly clear and dry, then your food has equalized. The moisture has spread out evenly through every piece and settled below that danger line. Now, and only now, is it truly safe to store for the long haul. That's when you move it to your permanent jars. Tuck them somewhere cool, dark, and dry, and rest easy. That is the whole secret. The old women did it by instinct, feeling the food with their fingers, packing it in crocks and checking it. The government wrote it down in plain English in 1917 for families who had nothing but a garden and a will to survive. And somewhere in the rush toward freezers and packaged food, that one quiet step, the difference between safe food and spoiled food, got dropped from the common knowledge of an entire nation. I want you to imagine it, a little glass jar on your windowsill, catching the morning light, filled with apple rings or green beans you grew and dried yourself. You pick it up, you give it a shake, you hold it to the light, and the glass is clear, bone dry. In that moment you know something with total certainty. You know your food is safe, you know you did it with your own hands, and you know you did it without paying a soul. That clear glass is the same thing my grandmother saw on her porch, the same thing a farm wife saw in 1917, the same thing that kept families alive through the Depression. It's a straight line of knowledge running all the way back, and now it runs to you. That's what this was always about. Not just apples and beans. It's about the quiet feeling of knowing you can feed yourself, that you don't need permission or a subscription or a machine plugged into a wall to keep your family fed through a hard winter. Somebody decided that feeling wasn't profitable enough to let you keep, and piece by piece, we're taking it back. If you've felt it too, that nagging sense that a whole world of real, useful knowledge got quietly set aside so that somebody could sell you the expensive version, then you already understand what this channel is. You're the kind of person who still trusts a lemon and a screen door over a shiny bag with a long list of ingredients you can't pronounce. And I think there are more of us than they'd like to admit. So tell me one thing. Write down in the comments. Did anybody in your family string leather breeches, or dry apples on the roof, or scald their beans before drying them? What did they call it in your part of the world, and what did they dry that I didn't mention today? I read these, and I learn from you every single time, so don't keep it to yourself. Somebody reading needs to hear it. And if you want to keep recovering this kind of buried practical wisdom, the methods they stopped teaching us on purpose, then stay with me here, because this is a gathering place for people who refuse to forget how to take care of themselves. Next time, I'm going to show you the old way of storing root vegetables through the whole winter, with nothing but sand and a box in a cool corner, no refrigeration at all, a trick that kept cellars full for generations. You won't believe how simple it is, and you'll wonder, same as I did, why nobody ever told you. Let me leave you with one more thing about the low and slow rule, because I glossed over something important, and I don't want you to make the mistake I made. When I said keep the temperature between 95 and 145 degrees, there's a reason the range is that wide, and knowing it will save you a lot of frustration. For delicate herbs, for basil and mint and oregano, you want the very bottom of that range, the coolest air you can manage, because the flavor lives in those fragile oils, and high heat cooks them right out of the leaf. For fruits, you want the middle. And for meats, if you ever dry meat into jerky, you want the top of that range and a hot start, because meat carries risk that fruit does not, and you need that heat early to keep it safe. Match the warmth to the food, and you'll never ruin a batch again. And speaking of meat, let me give you one last piece of forgotten history, because it ties everything together, and it's the oldest drying secret on this continent. Long before any Europeans set foot here, the native peoples of the northern plains made something called pemmican. They took lean meat and dried it hard in the sun and wind, low and slow, exactly the principle we've been talking about. Then they pounded it into a powder, mixed it with rendered fat and dried berries, and packed it away. That food could last for years without any refrigeration, and it carried enough concentrated nutrition to keep a person alive and strong through the brutal cold. Fur traders and explorers depended on it. It was, pound for pound, one of the most efficient foods human beings have ever made, and it was built entirely on the same simple truth we started with. Take the water out, gently, and food becomes something that waits for you faithfully instead of rotting. That's the whole thread, from the plains people with their pemmican, to the farm wives with their leather breeches, to a government bulletin in 1917, to my grandmother on that porch roof with her bedsheet of apples, all the way down to you, standing in your kitchen tonight, holding a jar up to the light. The knowledge existed, somebody let it fall out of our hands because there was more money in our forgetting. But it never actually died. It hid in the memories of old women and the pages of old bulletins, waiting for somebody to want it again. You wanted it. That's why you clicked. And now it's yours to use this week, this season, with the oven you already own, the screen in your window, the car in your driveway, and a few jars on the sill catching the morning sun. Start with one thing. Dry a tray of apples with a lemon dip, low and slow, then condition them in a jar for a week, and watch the glass stay clear. When it works, and it will, you'll feel that old independence come back into your hands, and I promise you won't want to give it up again. I'll see you next time, when we fill that cellar with sand and root vegetables and recover one more thing they hoped we'd forget. Before you go, here's what comes next. This video gave you the overview, but inside the Wise Living Circle, I walk you through the full no-machine drying method, food by food, the part we couldn't fit here. In there you can ask me your own question, and a real person, me, answers you myself. And you won't be alone. Just point your phone's camera at the code on screen. Cancel anytime with one click. Come join me.